This is a Clark University podcast.
I shop, so I go out, and recently I've been paying attention to prices as well. I would say that we will probably continue to suffer until the end of this year, but things will probably get better as we head into, hopefully, 2023. It's kind of hard to predict.
That's Edouard Wemy, an economics professor at Clark University. Like other consumers across the country, Wemy is keeping a close eye on his budget. As Americans grapple with inflation, the Fed has raised the interest rate a slight amount, and fears of a recession linger.
So we can speak based on, just like we always say in economics, based on what we know today. The short term to medium term are going to be quite hard in terms of our wallet. So we're going to continue to feel the pain in terms of food prices, in terms of energy prices. Assuming that things get better, in terms of the war and in terms of COVID, then of course, the Fed is going to be able to rein in inflation. Some of those supply disruptions will disappear, energy prices will come down, and it will be reflected in terms of food prices and everything that we see. As economists, we always want to claim that we know the answers to everything, but we don't. I always tell my students, if I had a glass to be able to tell the future, I would be a millionaire.
I'm Melissa Hanson, a producer in Clark's communications office, and this is Challenge Change.
Wages are growing, so that's a good thing. And most of the jobs have been recovered as well. I think about 20 million jobs were lost. I think 14 millions, if I'm not mistaken. 14 to 16 millions have been recovered already. The economy is kind of getting back to where it was prior to the COVID shock. I feel like we need more data in order to actually gauge what is happening. I do understand that in the beginning, most economists and even the Fed thought that this was going to be a temporary phenomenon, but it's been lasting for a while.
America is heading toward an economy that resembles pre-pandemic times, but even then, things were not perfect.
We kind of had recovered from the 2008 crisis. I wouldn't say that the economy was running at full capacity, like the engine was running smoothly. But yeah, the pandemic was a big shock. As usual, when there is a shock, a negative shock to the economy, you would assume that normal economic activity is going to be disrupted. Firms are not going to be able to produce, we're not going to be able to consume. We just didn't know what to expect, but we knew that it would be severe. I'm not a historian, but I think it would be good to look at, in terms of history, how COVID compares to the other disasters that have happened in the history of the United States. Things could have been worse.
So are we on the way to a recession now? It's a question on the minds of people across the country.
Not likely, yeah. It is not likely that we might have a recession. Or even if we have a recession, it's not going to be very severe. The reason why people are saying it is because they're probably comparing it to what happened in the 1980s. It is kind of hard to project that we're going to have a recession just because the Fed is increasing interest rate. That happened in the 1970s, early 1980s, when Paul Volcker was trying to fight inflation, but the situations are not comparable, in my opinion.
Wemy thinks comparing the present situation to the economics of the 1980s is like comparing apples and oranges.
Well, they're not comparable because interest rates now were pretty low compared to what they were back in the 1980s. And then inflation was not even the same. It was probably in double digits. We haven't seen those levels in the past 40 years. Wages were kind of stagnant. They're not stagnant today. So it is quite unlikely that such measures that were put in place in the 1980s to fight inflation would be put in place today. And also the conditions were different. If you compare to what happened in the 1970s, like from an historical point of view, we're just coming from the Vietnam War, so there was kind of like loose money. And I would say the economy was in a pretty shaky situation to begin with. Sure, we are in a shaky situation, but kind of different.
Wemy explains why the Fed raises the interest rate and what that means for consumers.
The Fed has a dual mandate, so price stability and maximum to full unemployment. So the Fed would typically, they would increase the interest rate when the rate of inflation, when inflation is increasing. And this is exactly what they did. What does it mean for consumer? Well, credit is not going to be cheap. Money is just not going to be cheap. If you want to borrow money to buy a car, if you want to borrow money to buy a house, any kind of borrowing that you're going to do is going to be affected. Regardless of what they do, it is going to increase the rate at which we are borrowing money. So from a consumer perspective, that's how we definitely going to feel it. Like if you think about what happened in the 1980s when interest rates were pretty high, I recall reading a piece where home builders sent 2x4 wooden planks to the Fed to complain about how they were hurting their businesses. Yeah, it makes it very hard. It just makes it very hard for firms to borrow, for home builders to borrow, even to build houses.
Of course, the effects are felt hardest by people with a lower income. Could the Biden administration do more to help? Wemy supports the extension of the student loan repayment pause.
That's a great policy. Now in terms of erasing it completely, that's a different debate. Some people are suggesting other things. Maybe they should erase it for low-income families instead of people who make certain, but I don't know. It's kind of hard to know the effect that it will have. But if they're thinking about just erasing it, I think they should erase it for everyone. It will benefit. Even if you come from a certain level of income that is higher than the low level of income, you may use this money, you can save it towards buying a house. You can save it towards getting married, you can save it toward other projects, that you couldn't be doing, because of the fact that you have to pay this loan. So yeah, the Biden administration, that was a great decision. That was a great decision to extend it, at least until we have more information on the path that inflation is taking.
Through the rest of the year, a few things will dictate what happens with the economy and inflation rates. The war in Ukraine will make an impact. So would another widespread COVID variant.
I would say the next few months will be telling. The war in Ukraine and Russia is pretty much what at least I'm keeping an eye on to see what would happen.
To learn more about economics at Clark, visit clarku.edu/economics. Challenge Change is produced by Melissa Hansen and Andrew Hart for Clark University. Find other episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.
1, 2, 3, Clark!